What shapes a people's deepest sense of self? Especially when they've faced millennia of challenges. How do things like history, belief, even really profound trauma, how does that get woven into the very fabric of identity? Creating something. Well, both incredibly resilient and sometimes deeply complex.
A huge question.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a pretty crucial journey into the fascinating and often misunderstood psychology of Jewish identity. This isn't just some academic exercise, right?
Not at all.
It's an exploration that's, frankly, vital for understanding complex global dynamics and, well, fundamental human behavior. We'll be drawing from a really rich social psychological analysis. It looks at Jewish identity, the concept of chosenness, and then compares it to extremist ideologies.
A very detailed analysis.
Our mission today is to unpack these concepts with real precision. We want to carefully distinguish between mainstream understandings and, well, the dangerous distortions you sometimes hear. We're aiming to offer you a nuanced, well-informed perspective.
Cutting through the noise, hopefully.
Yeah. Get ready for some insights, maybe some aha moments. Because we're going to unravel some profound ideas. How groups form identity, how they cope with adversity, and how extremism really deviates from the foundations it claims to represent.
It's quite a journey.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're starting right at the bedrock of the Jewish psyche. And this isn't just about, individual experience.
No, it's much deeper than that.
It's deeply tied to a collective narrative, one forged over thousands of years. So what's the very first, maybe even surprising, key concept we need to wrap our heads around here? What's foundational?
Well, a really foundational insight here is that traditional Jewish thought. It defines human nature not by some external battle between good and evil, but by an internal dynamic.
Internal.
Yes. Unlike some theological systems that might picture, say, a pure soul fighting an external corrupting force of sin, Jewish thought, especially you see it detailed in the Talmud, emphasizes forces within us. Is this ongoing internal interplay.
Okay, so not a pristine soul battling some demon outside, but more like a constant negotiation, a management within oneself. That sounds, well, like a heavy weight of responsibility.
It truly is.
Yeah.
And at the heart of this is the concept of Yetzer Hatav and Yetzer Hara. Now, Yetzer Hatav is the inclination to do good. Simple enough. But Yetzer Hara, it's often mistranslated as the evil inclination.
Right, I've heard that.
But here's the crucial point. Yetzer Hara isn't external sin. It's understood as an innate, fundamental part of the human constitution. It's the source of our ambition, our desires, our drive, our passion,
Okay, so it's not inherently bad.
Exactly. The lifelong project, the real challenge, is to properly channel and manage this Yetzer Hara. If it's left unchecked, that's when it can lead to destructive behavior. So this model profoundly emphasizes individual agency and free will. It really promotes a psychology of continuous self-development and nuanced self-awareness.
That's a really powerful distinction. It puts such a huge emphasis on personal responsibility, doesn't it? On self-governance. But I can imagine, well, the strong emphasis on free will, on accountability, it might create some tension with modern psychology, which often looks at things like the unconscious or biological factors influencing behavior.
You've hit on a really important point there. There has historically been some tension, yes. Classical concepts like, the unconscious or contemporary approaches that stress psychopharmacology and the physiological basis of mental disorders.
Yeah.
They can challenge that traditional Jewish notion of freedom.
How so?
Well, by suggesting that behavior is influenced by forces beyond our conscious control. And this traditional emphasis on free will is absolutely essential for the system of mitzvah, the commandments.
Right, because they assume you can choose.
Precisely. They're predicated on individual choice. And because of this, some observant Jewish communities have been, let's say, slow to fully adopt certain insights from modern psychology. There was a fear it might undermine that core principle of accountability.
That makes sense, a potential conflict.
But here's where it gets really interesting. This internal conflict-based model of the psyche. It might well be a key cultural precursor to the development of modern psychology itself.
Really? How?
Well, it's a well-documented phenomenon, actually. There's this disproportionate representation of Jewish thinkers among the founders of psychology's major theoretical schools. Think Sigmund Freud, Abraham Maslow, Max Wertheimer.
Huh. I never really thought about that concentration.
Right. A culture that normalizes and provides a really rich vocabulary for analyzing internal conflict and ambivalent human motivations, which is the very essence of the Yetzer model, that created incredibly fertile intellectual and emotional ground for the systematic exploration of the human mind.
So are you suggesting that Freud's id, ego, and superego, those foundational concepts, could almost be seen as a secular version of these ancient Jewish ideas, a secular articulation? That's quite a connection to draw.
Indeed. You could certainly argue that the Freudian model, with its tripartite structure and constant negotiation, it resonates strongly. It can be seen as a secular, systematic articulation of the same dynamic tensions that the Talmudic sages were describing millennia prior. It's a fascinating intellectual legacy. It suggests the significant Jewish contribution to psychology isn't just some historical coincidence, but maybe a direct intellectual outgrowth of its core psychological worldview.
Wow. So less about battling external evil, more about managing the impulses within, a truly internal project of growth. And this internal focus seems to have maybe laid some groundwork for modern psychological thought. Okay, beyond this self-management piece, what else defines this unique cultural foundation?
Well, building on that point, it's not just about the internal management, it's also about how that internal life gets expressed externally, particularly how emotions are processed. Jewish culture seems to have cultivated a distinctive approach here, characterized by a strong preference for verbal expression and intellectual analysis.
So, talking things out, not keeping emotions bottled up. That sounds like quite a specific cultural norm to develop over time.
It is. Studies of Jewish families have often observed this cultural preference for verbalizing emotions, especially the negative or painful experiences. And this preference is often linked, historically speaking, to circumstances of oppression, segregation, and very close-knit communities where, pain was deeply felt and maybe more plainly communicated.
Interesting. Any specific examples?
Well, there's the anthropologist Mark Zborowski's research. He noted a tendency back then for Jews to respond more quickly and expressively to physical discomfort compared to some other groups he studied. Within the family unit, problems are often discussed in, let's say, great detail. Individuals are often encouraged to let out their feelings for catharsis, primarily through communication.
That's fascinating. And it connects, I imagine, to a reputation for intellectual rigor, too. The foundational texts, like the Torah and Talmud, they must be more than just legal or historical documents, then, in this view.
Oh, absolutely. They are incredibly rich with psychological wisdom. They explore multiple layers of meaning in human behavior and social dynamics. This cultural heritage, valuing both emotional expression and rigorous intellectual inquiry, it's profoundly shaped Jewish contributions to the broader world. It likely helps explain the disproportionate number of Jews you find in the helping and mental health professions.
That connection makes sense.
Yeah, and many Jewish pioneers in psychology actually actively use their work to advocate against things like hereditary intelligence notions and to deconstruct ethnic stereotypes. It seems to reflect a cultural predisposition to challenge simplistic interpretations of human behavior.
It's striking how both emotional expression and intellectual rigor are so deeply intertwined here. But how does all this translate into what we understand as Jewish identity today? It sounds like something that's probably constantly evolving.
That's a crucial question. And you're right, it evolves. The very concept of Jewish identity, as we discuss it now, is actually surprisingly modern.
Modern, really?
Yeah. The term itself really gained prominence after the 1950s. It was largely popularized by Erik Erikson's work on identity in the broader culture. Its adoption within the Jewish world was really driven by significant shifts after the Holocaust and the period of emancipation.
So it's not some fixed ancient label people always use?
No, not the way we use it now. Its meaning has been fluid. Just look at American Jewish education, for example. It shifted from viewing Jewishness primarily as a race or nation before World War II, then more as a religion from about 1945 into the 1980s, and more recently, often framed as a cultural expression.
Huh. So that fluidity, it's not weakness.
Not at all. You could see it as an adaptive mechanism. And crucially, Jewish identity is not monolithic. It's a complex interplay of objective and subjective elements. It encompasses nationhood, ethnicity, religion, and culture. A significant number of secular individuals, for instance, maintain a very strong sense of Jewish identity grounded in shared culture, history, and peoplehood, often without religious orthodoxy.
So what are the core pillars then? What holds this multifaceted identity together if it's so fluid? What does it hinge on?
Well, there are several key pillars that seem consistent. First, there's a shared narrative of common ancestry, descending from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Second, shared historical memories, collective recollections of foundational events like the Exodus, Sinai, the Babylonian captivity, and of course, more recent traumas like the Holocaust.
Okay, ancestry and memory.
Third, a common culture, This includes religious practices, languages like Hebrew and Yiddish historically, customs, values, and finally, a deep symbolic connection to the land of Israel as an origin point, a focal point, even for those living in the diaspora for generations.
That makes sense. Those are strong ties. But for any group, especially a minority group, how does the outside world, the majority, influence this self-identity?
Oh, that's a critical element. The psychology of a minority group is profoundly shaped by its perception of the majority. For Jews, identity is constantly being negotiated in relation to the other. How Jews believe they are seen by non-Jews, what scholars sometimes call subjective public identity, that heavily influences their own self-identity.
And I imagine anti-Semitism plays a role there, unfortunately.
Painfully, yes. Anti-Semitism has historically played a powerful, though obviously negative, role in both shaping and reinforcing Jewish identity over centuries.
So it's this constant negotiation, and that must lead to internal tension sometimes about what it means to be Jewish in the modern world.
It absolutely does. The ongoing debate, sometimes anxiety surrounding the definition and future of Jewish identity, it isn't necessarily a symptom of its erosion. Instead, you could see it as reflecting an unresolved psychological tension right at the heart of modern Jewish existence. It's the need to maintain distinctiveness for group survival, that's particularism, while simultaneously integrating into the wider society for safety, for success, that's universalism. It's a fascinating, ongoing balancing act.
So identity is fluid, it's multifaceted, forged in relation to others. But when we talk about history, you said it's not just in the textbooks, it feels like a living force, especially for the Jewish people.
Absolutely. This is where the concept of Zachor becomes really central. History isn't passive for the Jewish people. It's understood as an active, binding obligation. The biblical command, Zachor, which means remember, elevates memory to a sacred religious pact. As the scholar Yosef Haim Yerushalmi famously argued, Judaism is essentially a religion structured around a cult of memory.
A cult of memory, that's such a powerful phrase. What does that actually look like in practice? How does that manifest for the Jewish people?
Well, it's most evident in major festivals. They aren't just commemorations. They're ritualized acts of re-experiencing the past. Yeah. Think about the Passover Seder, for example. Participants are commanded to see themselves as if they personally experienced the exodus from Egypt.
So not just recalling it, but putting yourself in it.
Exactly. It's not just about recalling history. It's what some call a liturgical technology. It's designed to psychologically transport individuals into the foundational moments of their people's history, making that memory visceral, personal, immediate.
So it's about feeling it, not just knowing about it. And this kind of collective memory, it must be different from what a professional historian does, right? It's not objective history in that sense.
Precisely. Yerushalmi noted that distinction very clearly. For most of Jewish history, the community and its rituals, not formal historians, were the primary custodians of the past. And this collective memory is inherently selective. It doesn't aim for a comprehensive, objective record like a historian might.
What does it aim for then?
It aims to preserve the meaning and the archetypal patterns of key events. The goal is to ensure their continued relevance and moral force for the present generation. The core of this memory is really an origin myth, found in Deuteronomy, focusing on oppression in Egypt and divine salvation. This foundational story, structured specifically for recitation and reenactment in rituals, ensured its remarkable cultural persistence over millennia.
It's a history that you don't just learn, you live it through ritual. And when that history is so full of suffering, as it often is, how does that shape the collective identity? How does that profound suffering get passed down, become part of who you are across generations?
This brings up a really critical point. How does profound suffering become so deeply integrated that it shapes identity across generations? You're right, the content of Jewish collective memory is heavily laden with experiences of persecution and catastrophe. This creates a powerful nexus between trauma and identity. The sociological concept of cultural trauma helps us understand this.
Cultural trauma.
Yeah, it refers to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon a group's consciousness, irrevocably changing their future identity.
Is this unique to the Jewish experience, or do many cultures institutionalize trauma in this way?
Well, while many cultures certainly experience trauma, the Jewish experience is perhaps notable for its very long history of actively processing and institutionalizing these traumatic events into its collective consciousness. The Holocaust, of course, stands as the archetypal 20th century cultural trauma. It was so profound, it really carried the concept of trauma from the individual psychological level to the collective societal level.
So it's not just that traumatic events happen, but that they are actively folded into the group's ongoing narrative and identity. There's a process there.
Exactly. For a traumatic event to become a permanent part of a group's identity, it usually requires some process of institutionalization and commemoration. Think memorials, museums, and maybe most importantly, rituals. Jewish history provides a long-standing model for this. Look at medieval tragedies like the massacres during the First Crusade in 1096 or the Spanish expulsion in 1492. These weren't just allowed to fade into history.
What happened instead?
Communities responded actively. They created new rituals, or they subsumed the memory of new tragedies into existing days of mourning, like Tisha B'Av, which already commemorated the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem.
That's a really sophisticated psychological mechanism for integration, isn't it? It's like weaving these traumatic threads continuously into the present fabric.
It is. And this deep-seated historical consciousness remains incredibly potent today. When contemporary traumatic events occur, you can think of the Hamas attacks of October 7, 2023. As a recent example, they immediately reignite this consciousness. They can blur the lines between past and present.
How so?
Archetypal images, particularly potent ones from the Holocaust, tend to resurface with powerful emotional force. This phenomenon, sometimes described as a transhistorical logic, means that current events are often intuitively understood and felt through the lens of past existential threats.
So it's not just about what happened recently, but how it resonates with the weight of centuries of past threats. That sounds, well, like a double-edged sword. Maybe a source of resilience, but also maybe heightened threat perception.
You're absolutely right. It's exactly a double-edged sword. The psychological process of keeping trauma alive in the collective memory. On one hand, it serves as a powerful source of resilience. It creates a cognitive framework of, we have survived this before and we will survive it again.
That's the strength side.
Right. But on the other hand, it can create a state of heightened, almost perpetual threat perception. Present-day conflicts get filtered through the accumulated weight of historical trauma. This can make objective assessment of current dangers difficult, and it might lead to responses that seem, from an outside perspective, disproportionate to the immediate reality, because psychologically, they're calibrated to address the existential threats of the past.
So the effects aren't just limited to those who lived through the trauma directly. It sounds like it can actually be passed down through generations.
Precisely. We see the profound impact of what's called intergenerational transmission. The psychological effects of historical trauma are definitely not confined to the generations that directly experience them. Research increasingly shows that trauma can be transmitted to subsequent generations through psychological, sociocultural, and maybe even biological mechanisms.
Wow, biological too.
There's emerging research in that area, yes. It means that children and grandchildren of survivors, people who never witnessed the events themselves, can still inherit and manifest some psychological sequelae.
How does that transmission actually happen? What are the mechanisms at play there?
Well, primarily it seems to happen through family dynamics. Things like storytelling, both what's explicitly said and maybe even more powerfully what's left unsaid, the silences. It's also transmitted through learned parenting styles. For example, survivors might exhibit high anxiety or hypervigilance, which can then shape their children's emotional development, and through altered attachment behaviors between parent and child.
And the biological aspect.
That's the newer area. Emerging biological and epigenetic models suggest that extreme trauma might induce biological changes that could potentially be passed down. There's research, for instance, on abnormal cortisol regulation that's a stress hormone in children of Holocaust survivors. It indicates that physiological stress response signals might somehow be transmitted.
That's incredibly impactful, affecting people generations later.
Yeah.
But despite this legacy of transmitted trauma, you mentioned earlier a robust psychology of resilience. How does that manifest itself? How does that work alongside the trauma?
It's a crucial counterpoint. Despite this legacy of transmitted trauma, or maybe in part because of it, Jewish culture has developed a remarkably robust and, importantly, a taught psychology of resilience. This resilience isn't just passive endurance. It's an active tradition, deeply embedded in religious and cultural practice.
Taught. How is resilience taught?
Through narratives, through rituals, through interpretations of texts. Analysis of Jewish tradition identifies at least 6 core elements often emphasized: endurance, hope, the ability to live with uncertainty, remembering the past, as we discussed, the ability to rebuild after destruction, and the strength of belief. These are actively reinforced. Hope, for example, is instilled through teachings like Rabbi Akiva's, who, even facing Roman persecution, famously taught, Everything that God does, he does for the best. It's a radical reframing.
So it's not just about bouncing back from hardship, but a deeper, almost philosophical approach to suffering, one that constructs meaning from it.
Exactly. This resilience isn't just bouncing back in the simple sense. It's a proactive, sophisticated strategy for constructing meaning out of suffering. Collective trauma, at its core, is often a crisis of meaning. Why did this happen? What does it mean? The Jewish cultural response has often been to reframe trauma as a catalyst for renewed purpose.
How does that work?
It's evident in cultural drivers like strong commitment to justice, which is tzedakah, and maybe most notably today, the concept of tikkun olam, the ethical obligation to repair the world.
Tikkun olam, repair the world. So suffering isn't just something to be endured passively, but something that can actually lead to a moral imperative, a call to action.
Yes, precisely. This framework transforms suffering. It moves it from being maybe a mark of divine disfavor or just simple historical victimhood into a force that sharpens the group's mission. A mission to bring light and kindness into what's seen as a broken world by providing a powerful answer to the question, why do we suffer? This psychological reframing transforms the group from passive victims of history into active agents with a moral and ethical mandate. This proactive meaning-making, it's arguably the single most important psychological factor explaining Jewish cultural survival across millennia of often intense persecution.
That's a really profound way to look at how identity and resilience are forged together. Now, let's turn to a concept that's, while it's often misconstrued, sometimes even weaponized, the idea of chosenness. What's the mainstream understanding of this within Judaism?
Right, this is where it's vital to be clear because, as you say, it's so easily misinterpreted. The idea that the Jewish people are chosen is indeed a core belief across Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism. It originates right there in the Torah. The Hebrew term often used is am segula.
M. Sigula, what does that translate to, roughly?
It generally translates to something like treasured nation, or perhaps peculiar treasure.
Okay, so a special status. But how does mainstream theology prevent that from sliding into a claim of superiority? Because that's often how it's portrayed externally.
That's the key misunderstanding. Mainstream Jewish theology explicitly, overwhelmingly rejects any interpretation of chosenness as ethnic or racial supremacy. Instead, it's almost universally understood as a selection for the arduous mission or purpose.
A mission.
Yes, the mission to be a light unto the nations, the phrase is, or lagoyim, to exemplify the covenant relationship with God and to teach monotheism and morality to the world. It's framed not as a privilege, but as a profound responsibility, even a burden.
A burden, not a privilege.
Yeah, absolutely. The prophet Amos, for instance, delivers a message from God, saying, "You alone have I singled out amongst all the families of the earth. That is why I will call you to account for all your iniquities." This underscores the idea that being chosen entails higher scrutiny, higher standards, and potentially severe punishment for failure. It is a burden, definitely not a license for special treatment or superiority. And this aligns perfectly with Tikkun Olam. Chosenness is understood by many as a call to action, to positively impact creation through fulfilling the mitzvot, the commandments.
So it's fundamentally about a sacred responsibility to humanity, not some declaration of superiority over humanity. And I think some thinkers have even tried to expand this into a more universal framework, haven't they?
Indeed. Rabbi Lord Emanuel Jacobitz, for example, a former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, proposed that chosenness could be understood as part of a divine division of labor, you might say. In his view, every nation has a distinct God-given purpose, maybe the Greeks for philosophy, the Romans for law, and the Jews for pioneering religion and morality. This interpretation entirely removes the notion of exclusive selection, recasting it as a universal system where each nation has a unique vocation.
That completely changes the framing, doesn't it? So the psychological function of chosenness in its mainstream understanding is fundamentally different from supremacism.
Precisely. The psychological function of chosenness within its mainstream theological context is actually antithetical to supremacism. Supremacism is a psychology of entitlement, usually based on some claim of inherent superiority. Chosenness, in contrast, is fundamentally a psychology of obligation based on a specific covenantal relationship.
So what is its primary psychological function then?
Historically, its primary psychological function seems to have been to provide a cognitive framework for enduring a long, often brutal history of persecution. It answers the agonizing question, why do we suffer so much because we have a unique and difficult role to play in the world. It transforms suffering from just being a sign of weakness or disfavor into a testament to purpose and endurance. It's really a sophisticated psychological coping mechanism, not a declaration of superiority.
Okay, so a sacred responsibility, not superiority. But has this concept always been universally accepted within Judaism itself? Have there been internal voices, Jewish voices, that challenge this idea of chosenness?
That's a really insightful question. What happens when internal voices challenge such a fundamental concept? And yes, despite these mainstream interpretations focusing on responsibility, the doctrine of chosenness has faced significant criticism from within the Jewish world itself, most notably perhaps from Reconstructionist Judaism.
Reconstructionist Judaism.
Yes, its founder, Rabbi Mordecai M. Kaplan, writing in the early 20th century, actually rejected the concept of chosenness entirely.
On what grounds? What was Kaplan's argument?
Well, Kaplan approached Judaism from a more naturalist, sociological perspective. He argued that the idea of a supernatural God favoring one particular nation was incompatible with modern scientific and democratic thought. It conflicted, in his view, with principles of universal equality.
So, how did Reconstructionism deal with it?
Reconstructionist thought essentially reconstructs this aspect of tradition. It replaces the idea of chosenness with a concept of a vocation. This reframing maintains a sense of purpose-driven Jewish existence, but it grounds it in universal egalitarianism. The idea is that each people contributes uniquely to civilization, but without any divine elevation of one over others. This internal critique is important. It underscores the central debate within modern Judaism regarding chosenness is often about its compatibility with universalism, not about it being insufficiently supremacist.
So the idea itself has been debated, even rejected internally. Fascinating. But what about external critics? How do they often misrepresent chosenness? You mentioned it being weaponized. You mentioned it being weaponized.
Right. External critics often decontextualize the concept entirely. This leads to serious misinterpretations and, as you said, its ideological weaponization. They tend to interpret chosenness through a very simplistic, often hostile lens of straightforward supremacism, completely ignoring its complex theological context of mission and responsibility.
How do they do that? What's the mechanism of misinterpretation?
Often they'll point to certain violent passages in the Hebrew Bible, for instance, those dealing with the conquest of Canaan in Deuteronomy, and present them as prima facie evidence of inherent supremacism. They do this without acknowledging the millennia of rabbinic interpretation that has overwhelmingly spiritualized and ethicized these texts, moving away from literal application.
So ignoring the tradition of interpretation.
It's exactly. Furthermore, because Judaism is generally non-proselytizing and has a strong ethno-cultural component, its specific covenantal relationship can appear more exclusionary than universalizing faiths like Christianity or Islam, which actively seek converts. This structural difference can make the idea of a chosen people more susceptible, perhaps, to being misinterpreted by outsiders as a claim of ethnic superiority, even when that's not the internal understanding.
Okay. We've built a really solid understanding now of mainstream Jewish identity and the complex concept of chosenness. Now, let's turn to a concept that's highly charged, often misunderstood, and where we really need to draw a clear line: Jewish supremacy.
Yes, this is a crucial distinction to make. The term Jewish supremacy itself, it's almost exclusively used externally, either as a polemic, a critical term, or frankly as a tool for hatred. It's generally not a self-descriptor used by any mainstream Jewish movement.
So where do we see it used?
Its usage really arises in two distinct, highly charged contexts. First, you see it used as a polemical and critical term by some academics, activists, and human rights organizations. They use it to describe certain Israeli government policies towards Palestinians, sometimes arguing these policies create a system tantamount to apartheid or Jewish supremacy in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Organizations like B'Tselem and Israeli Human Rights Group have used this kind of framing.
So in that first context, it's being used to describe a political system or governmental policies, not necessarily a religious or cultural belief system held by all Jews.
Precisely. It's a political critique. Some scholars even argue that a form of Jewish supremacy has been a dominating principle within Zionism from its inception. Conversely, other scholars and commentators argue that this framing is a dangerous fallacy that conflates the actions of a political state, Israel, with Judaism as a religion or the Jewish people as a whole. It's a highly contested political debate.
Okay, that's the first context. What's the second?
The second context is, well, much uglier. It's used as a straightforward propaganda tool, wielded by anti-Semitic and far-right extremist groups, like the so-called Goyim Defense League. They use the term Jewish supremacy to promote classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and incite hatred against Jews.
Got it. So for our purposes here, for a precise psychological analysis in this deep dive, how are we defining Jewish supremacy?
Right. To be clear and analytical, we're focusing on Jewish supremacy as the specific, identifiable ideology of recognized Jewish extremist and terrorist organizations, groups that explicitly advocate for a theocratic, ethnically purified state. This is distinct from the broader political debates about Zionism or the general anti-Semitic tropes used by hate groups. We're looking at a defined extremist ideology.
So focusing on the fringes here, the actual extremist groups that hold these views, and the most prominent example, historically and currently, would be Kahanism, right?
Yes, exactly. Kahanism is the most prominent and well-documented ideology that fits this specific definition of Jewish supremacism we're using for analysis. It's a religious Zionist, extremist ideology founded by the late Rabbi Meir Kahan back in the late 1960s and 70s.
Okay. What are the core tenets of Kahanism? How does it represent such a radical break from the mainstream Jewish thought we've been discussing?
The core tenets of Kahanism are pretty unambiguous, and they do represent a radical break. First, Kahanism advocates for a theocratic state. It calls for the dismantlement of Israel's current secular democracy and the establishment of a Jewish theocracy governed by a very ultra-conservative, selective interpretation of halakha, Jewish law. And this state would encompass what they call the biblical land of Israel, which includes not just Israel proper, but also the occupied territories and even parts of neighboring Arab countries.
A theocracy across a greater Israel. What else?
Second, it openly promotes racism and segregation. Kahanist ideology views Arabs as implacable enemies and explicitly calls for complete legal and social segregation between Jews and non-Jews within this envisioned state. Kahan himself proposed laws criminalizing intermarriage and even sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews.
That's incredibly restrictive and discriminatory. And what about their stance on non-Jewish populations already living in those areas?
That leads directly to the third tenet, expulsion and subjugation. Kahanism demands the expulsion of all non-Jews from this biblical land of Israel, unless they accept the status of Ger T'Chav, which translates roughly as resident stranger.
Resident stranger, what does that entail?
It means being stripped of all national and political rights, including the right to vote. It would require paying special taxes, and in some interpretations of Kahanist thought, it would essentially subject them to a form of servitude or slavery. And crucially, any non-Jew who refused this status would be forcibly removed.
That's a stark and truly alarming set of beliefs. What's the history of this movement within Israel? How has it manifested politically?
Well, this ideology was embodied by the political party Kash, which Kahan founded. After actually winning a single Knesset seat in the 1984 election, the party was subsequently banned by the Israeli Supreme Court on the grounds that it was racist and anti-democratic.
Banned by Israel itself?
Yes. Following Kahan's assassination in New York in 1990, the movement splintered. Kahan Chai, led by his son Binyamin, became the most notable offshoot. Then, after the 1994 Hebron massacre carried out by Baruch Goldstein, a Kahanist supporter, both Kafir and Kahanachai were formally declared terrorist organizations by both Israel and the United States.
So outlawed and designated as terrorist groups. Despite that, it sounds like the ideology hasn't simply disappeared. In fact, from what we read in the news, it seems to have gained some ground recently, perhaps.
It certainly hasn't disappeared. Kahanist ideology has persisted. And, disturbingly, in recent years, it's gained a kind of unprecedented political legitimacy within Israel. It continues to animate extremist groups like Lahava, which focuses on preventing Jewish assimilation, particularly intermarriage, and also the violent settlers known as the Hilltop Youth, who establish illegal outposts in the West Bank. But beyond those fringe groups, most significantly, there's been a mainstreaming of what are often called neo-Kahanist political parties. Chief among these is Otzma Yehudit, which means Jewish power, led currently by Itamar Ben-Gvir. This party, drawing directly on Kahanist ideology, has become a key coalition partner in recent Israeli governing coalitions, with its leaders holding powerful ministerial positions like National Security Minister.
Wow. From banned terrorist group to cabinet ministers, that's quite a trajectory. This is such a stark contrast to what we discussed earlier about mainstream Jewish identity, responsibility, complexity, the internal struggle. What psychological drivers could possibly fuel an ideology so extreme, so seemingly contradictory to foundational Jewish values, like, say, compassion or justice?
It's fascinating and disturbing to look at the psychology. Kahanism shares certain psychological drivers with other extremist ideologies we'll discuss, but it also has its unique twists, especially, as you noted, concerning its focus on internal enemies, not just external ones.
Okay, bring that down. What are the drivers?
Like many extremist groups, it's fueled by a deep-seated sense of grievance and existential threat. But this threat perception is directed not only at external enemies, primarily Arabs in their view, but also very strongly at internal enemies.
Internal enemies. Who do they mean?
They mean Israel's secular democracy itself and liberal or secular forms of Judaism. Kahan and his followers explicitly view Israel's democratic structure as betrayal of Jewish destiny. They see secular and liberal Judaism not as legitimate variations, but as a malignancy, a gentilized foreign culture, and ultimately the greatest threat to Jewish survival.
So it's not just about fighting an external threat, it's about purifying the group, the Jewish people, from within.
Exactly. This reveals a key psychological driver. The ideology is fundamentally totalitarian in its aims. Like many fascist movements, its primary goal isn't just to defeat an external enemy, but to forge a new, pure society by forcibly remaking the Jewish people themselves in its own rigid theocratic image. The external enemy, the Arab, often serves as a foil and a justification for this internal purification project.
And religion plays a role here.
A huge role. This internal focus is coupled with a powerful messianic religious nationalist fervor. The ultimate goal to impose their specific interpretation of halakha, establish a halakhic kingdom, is seen as fulfilling a divine mandate, restoring God's honor. This provides an incredibly powerful sense of purpose and mission, which can psychologically sanctify even violent actions in the eyes of adherents.
And their posture, their attitude seems to have shifted over time, too, from maybe defensive to something much more aggressive.
It definitely did. You can track an evolution in the movement psychology. It went from a kind of minority defense posture to a more aggressive expansionist one. The Jewish Defense League, JDL, which Kahan founded first in New York, started as a vigilante self-defense group for Jews facing anti-Semitism. But when Kahan moved to Israel, a state with a Jewish majority and a powerful army, the psychology shifted. It was no longer primarily about defending the weak. It became about purifying the nation, asserting dominance over Arabs, and crucially, over non-Kahanist Jews who didn't conform to their vision.
And this creates a very unique, complex relationship with the Israeli state itself, doesn't it? You said they're officially banned as terrorists, yet their ideological heirs hold government power.
This is truly unique to Kahanism compared to the other groups we'll look at. Kahanist groups are, on one hand, officially designated terrorist organizations. They stand in revolutionary opposition to the state's democratic foundations. Yet, on the other hand, their ideological descendants have successfully integrated into the highest levels of government, wielding actual state power.
That's a real paradox.
It creates a potent, perhaps schizophrenic psychological dynamic. Adherents can simultaneously see themselves as persecuted outsiders fighting a corrupt system, and as empowered insiders legitimized by state authority. This allows them to engage in both vigilante violence at the grassroots level and push for state-sanctioned discrimination from within the government. It's a complex, symbiotic relationship with power that really distinguishes Kahanism from the almost purely oppositional stances of, say, white supremacy or global Islamic terrorism.
That's a really comprehensive look at Kahanism. To truly understand extremism, though, we really need to compare it with others. Let's delve into white supremacy next. How does its psychology compare and contrast?
Right. It's important now to draw comparisons. If we connect Kahanism to the bigger picture of extremism, you see that all these ideologies are fundamentally about power, hierarchy, and a sense of entitlement. But their core justifications, their narratives, differ dramatically. White supremacy, while it has diverse factions, is generally anchored by some consistent core beliefs about race, power, and identity.
And the absolute core is?
Its foundational belief is that white people are biologically, intellectually, and culturally superior to all other races. Full stop.
So it's rooted in that very old, completely discredited idea of scientific racism?
Exactly. This belief system has deep historical roots in the pseudoscientific racism of the 19th century, which was used, of course, to justify colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, Jim Crow laws, and so on. The ultimate political goal for most modern white supremacist movements is the creation of a white ethno-state.
An ethno-state.
Yes, a state exclusively for white people. This requires, in their view, the radical restructuring of society to cease all non-white immigration, reverse multiculturalism, and ensure a permanent white demographic majority and political hegemony. Its enemies include all non-white races, often LGBTQ+ individuals as well. But critically, a special place in its demonology is almost always reserved for Jews.
Right. Jews are often cast as the puppet masters.
Precisely. As the secret, conspiratorial puppet masters who are supposedly orchestrating the decline of the white race.
That's a critical point, the absolutely central role of anti-Semitism in this ideology. What about the psychological profile? Who is drawn to white supremacist movements and why?
Psychologically, individuals drawn to these movements often share a powerful sense of what researchers call aggrieved entitlement. It's a potent mix of defensiveness and hostility felt by members of a dominant group who perceive their status, their privileges, as being under threat or unfairly taken away.
A sense of loss or impending loss.
Exactly. And this is often fueled by a kind of collective nostalgia, a romanticized vision of a past era where white dominance was supposedly unchallenged. The ideology itself offers a pre-packaged grandiose identity. I am a member of the superior race, which can be very appealing to individuals who lack a stable personal identity or sense of self-worth.
And demographic change plays into this.
Hugely. This sense of loss is powerfully activated by the fear of demographic change, which gets framed not as a natural process, but as a malicious plot. This is where you get the Great Replacement or white genocide conspiracy theory. And very often, Jewish elites are coded or explicitly named as the architects of this plot, supposedly aiming to replace white populations.
That narrative must be incredibly potent psychologically, that idea of replacement.
It is extremely potent because it taps directly into loss aversion. Psychologically, people are often far more agitated by the prospect of losing something they feel entitled to than by the prospect of gaining something new. And research suggests many adherents come from backgrounds marked by personal instability, perhaps trauma, neglect, abuse, violence in the home, or sometimes family socialization that supports racist or anti-Semitic views. They're often seeking belonging, purpose, empowerment in the group.
So people aren't necessarily born hating. They might be drawn in seeking something else, and then they're indoctrinated into the hate.
For many, yes. Hate is often not the initial motivation for joining. Rather, it's a learned outcome of group indoctrination and socialization within that extremist milieu. There's also research showing members often score higher on what psychologists call the dark triad traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And they tend to show a greater tendency to dehumanize outgroups, which critically lowers the psychological inhibitions against violence.
And you mentioned anti-Semitism and pseudoscience.
Yes, anti-Semitism is absolutely foundational. It often serves as the central organizing principle. Jews are cast as the primary conspiratorial enemy, blamed for controlling media, finance, government, and orchestrating the Great Replacement. It provides a paranoid explanation for why the supposedly superior white race is perceived to be in decline. And to lend a veneer of legitimacy, the ideology relies heavily on debunked pseudoscience, things like human biodiversity, which misuses genetics to argue for racial differences in intelligence or criminality, or reviving 19th century Aryan master race notions. This allows adherents to sort of bask in reflected glory, boosting their self-esteem through this imagined racial greatness.
It's chilling, really, how these ideologies provide these twisted answers for people seeking meaning or an explanation for their perceived grievances. Okay, now let's bring the third ideology into this comparative framework: Islamic terrorism. How does its psychology fit in?
This raises an important question. How does a sense of global grievance, a utopian vision, and often apocalyptic beliefs combine to create such a powerful engine for radicalization? Modern Islamic terrorism, particularly the global jihadist variety like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, is typically built on a powerful narrative of collective grievance.
Grievance again, like the others.
Yes, grievance is key. The primary push factor, you could say, is a deeply felt sense of injustice and victimization. The narrative posits that Islam and the global Muslim community, the Ummah, are under sustained attack from a perceived Crusader-Zionist alliance, essentially, the West, Israel, and governments in Muslim-majority countries seen as apostate or collaborators.
So a sense of being under siege, justifying a defensive, violent response. What specific grievances are often cited in their propaganda?
Common grievances highlighted include the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Western military interventions in Muslim lands, like Iraq or Afghanistan, perceived political repression of Islamists by secular regimes, and experiences of discrimination against Muslim minorities in Western countries. This narrative of persecution is crucial because it serves to legitimize violence as necessary self-defense.
Okay, that's the push factor. You mentioned poor factors, too.
Right. Complementing the grievance narrative are powerful pull factors. These often involve a utopian construction. Groups like ISIS, for example, were very effective at offering recruits a tangible role in building what they portrayed as a new, perfect world specifically, the reestablishment of the caliphate. They offered careers, community, a sense of belonging, and a significant role in this grand historical project.
So it's not just about fighting against the enemy, but actively building something new, something supposedly better.
Exactly. And this utopian vision is very often fused with an apocalyptic belief system. Many recruits are drawn by the idea that they are fulfilling end times prophecies, that they are the righteous warriors fighting in a final cosmic battle between good and evil. This combination, grievance, utopia, apocalypse, creates an explicitly supremacist ideology, advocating for the absolute supremacy of its particular interpretation of Islam and the necessity of imposing it globally.
So, how does an individual actually get drawn into this? What does the radicalization pathway look like psychologically?
It's generally understood as a psychological process, not a single event or profile. It often begins with what some researchers call a cognitive opening. This could be a personal crisis, job loss, death of a loved one, or a political crisis, witnessing discrimination, experiencing political repression that shakes the individual's existing beliefs and makes them vulnerable, receptive to a radical alternative worldview. While socioeconomic factors like poverty aren't direct predictors of terrorism, a sense of relative deprivation, feeling unjustly deprived compared to others, can certainly fuel frustration.
And identity plays a role here too.
A huge role. At its core, radicalization is often described as a quest for significance and identity. Individuals who feel alienated, marginalized, lacking purpose or meaning in their lives are particularly drawn to the powerful sense of belonging, honor, purpose, and mission offered by these groups. It's a chance to defend a threatened identity and be part of something larger than themselves. And recruiters are often adept at sophisticated psychological manipulation, almost like cult leaders, targeting vulnerable individuals.
And this process tends to unfold in stages, typically.
Yes, models often describe stages. First, maybe psychological submission. The recruit becomes isolated from their past life, friends, family, creating emotional dependency on the group and its leader. Second, indoctrination. There's a systematic installation of the group's ideology, denigrating critical thinking, replacing the individual's old identity with the new collective one. Finally, violent disinhibition. Violence is gradually legitimized, normalized, even framed as virtuous or obligatory. Responsibility for violence is shifted entirely onto the designated enemy.
And the internet and social media, they must have dramatically changed this whole recruitment and radicalization process.
Oh, they absolutely did.
Yeah.
Groups like ISIS in particular mastered the use of the internet and social media to dramatically accelerate and globalize this process. Through slick, high production value propaganda videos, active online forums, and targeted social media engagement, they could bypass the need for traditional face-to-face recruitment. They created a global virtual community that could spot, groom, and radicalize vulnerable individuals entirely remotely. This normalized the ideology for a much wider audience and projected an image of strength and success that was very alluring.
Now, we often hear about lone wolf or lone actor terrorists, but is radicalization still primarily a group phenomenon, or has the internet changed that too?
That's a really important question. While the phenomenon of lone actor terrorism, individuals radicalizing primarily online and acting alone, has certainly risen, research suggests most radicalization still occurs within or is significantly influenced by close-knit social groups. Friends, family, local study circles. That's where group polarization dynamics can really escalate extreme positions.
But the lone actors are still a significant concern.
Absolutely. The internet has facilitated self-radicalization online with minimal direct contact or control from a central organization. The psychological profile of a lone actor is often complex. Sometimes it fits what's called the bathtub model. Stressors and grievances gradually accumulate until a triggering event leads to violence. Often a personal grievance becomes intensely fused with the political ideology. These lone actors are particularly dangerous from a security perspective because their isolation leaves a minimal intelligence footprint, making their plots extremely difficult to detect beforehand.
Okay. This is a lot to process, and the details across these three ideologies, Kahanism, white supremacy, Islamic terrorism, are striking. We're seeing these common threads: grievance, the search for identity, the dehumanization of the other. But let's really nail down the key convergences and divergences now. What can we ultimately learn by putting them side by side like this?
Right. What's fascinating here is seeing how universal some psychological mechanisms of radicalization appear to be, even when the ideologies themselves are so utterly distinct, even mutually hostile. Despite their profound ideological differences, these three extremist movements exhibit really striking similarities in the psychological mechanisms that seem to drive radicalization. These points of convergence suggest there might be a kind of universal pattern in how vulnerable individuals get drawn into violent extremism.
Okay, so what's the biggest convergence you see? The most powerful shared element across all three?
I think one of the most powerful is the use of victimhood as a weapon. All three construct these incredibly potent narratives of group victimhood. This psychologically reframes their own in-group as the true victims, which then serves to morally justify aggression, even extreme violence, as merely righteous self-defense.
Can you give examples for each?
Sure. For Kahanists, the narrative draws on the long history of Jewish persecution, combined with perceived modern threats from Arabs and internal enemies. For white supremacists, it's the narrative of white genocide, or the Great Replacement, by non-white immigrants, supposedly orchestrated by Jews. For Islamic terrorists, it's the narrative of a global war against Muslims waged by the Crusader-Zionist alliance. In each case, this profound sense of being besieged creates a powerful psychological impetus for violent action.
And that ties directly, I imagine, into the dehumanization of the other, which seems to be a necessary prerequisite for committing violence against them.
Exactly. That's the second major convergence, the dehumanization of the other. It's absolutely crucial for enabling violence. All three movements employ rhetoric and propaganda designed to strip their designated enemies of human qualities. They're portrayed as subhuman, demonic, vermin, a cancerous threat that must be eliminated. This systematic dehumanization works to dismantle the moral and psychological inhibitions that normally prevent people from harming others. It makes violence seem not only permissible, but necessary, even virtuous.
Grievance, dehumanization. What's the third major convergence?
I'd say it's the search for identity and belonging. This is perhaps the most powerful shared psychological driver drawing individuals in. All three ideologies hold a strong appeal for individuals who feel alienated, marginalized, disenfranchised, or are simply seeking a clear identity and purpose in life.
How do they provide that?
Each offers a potent solution, a prepackaged, all-encompassing identity. Holy warrior, defender of the race, restorer of divine order, a strong sense of community and belonging within the group, and a clear, often world-changing mission. For someone grappling with personal trauma, social isolation, or lack of purpose, the allure of becoming part of something larger, something significant, can be almost irresistible psychologically.
Okay, so while the psychological pathways into radicalization share these disturbing commonalities, victimhood narratives, dehumanization, identity seeking, the actual content of the ideologies, their ultimate goals, their specific histories are wildly different. Let's really focus on those key divergences now.
Absolutely. While the processes of radicalization share common psychological pathways, the content, goals, and context of these ideologies are fundamentally distinct. And these differences are not trivial. They really define the specific nature and threat of each movement. One key divergence lies in their core ideological nature. You have a racial versus religious versus ethno-nationalist core.
Break that down.
White supremacy is fundamentally a racial project. Its core assertion is the biological superiority of the white race, and its goals and enemies are defined primarily in racial terms. Islamic terrorism, in the forms we discussed, is fundamentally a religious project. Its goal is to impose its specific interpretation of Islam globally. Identity is based on faith or rejection of it, and enemies are defined primarily by unbelief. Kufar. Jewish extremism, specifically Kahanism, is best understood as a theocratic ethno-nationalist project. It's a fusion of religious law and a specific national ethnic identity, and its goals are territorially limited, focused on the biblical land of Israel.
That's a crucial distinction in their scope and basis. And we've talked about the role of anti-Semitism within white supremacy quite a bit. But how does it differ from how anti-Jewish sentiment might appear in the other extremist groups?
Right, the specific role of anti-Semitism is another major point of divergence. White supremacy is unique among these three in its foundational, structural, and deeply conspiratorial anti-Semitism. The belief that a secret cabal of Jews controls the world and is actively orchestrating white decline is absolutely central to its worldview. It's often the linchpin holding the ideology together.
And for the others?
While Islamic terrorist groups are often virulently anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist, their primary theological enemy is usually framed more broadly as the unbeliever, Kufar, with the West often seen as the main political manifestation of that enemy. Anti-Jewish sentiment is strong, but it might not hold the same unique central conspiratorial function it does in white supremacy. And Kahanism, of course, as a Jewish ideology, is not anti-Semitic. This distinction is absolutely critical for understanding the unique paranoid structure of white supremacist thought compared to the others.
That's incredibly important to clarify. Okay, and the last major point of divergence you highlighted earlier was their relationship with state power.
Yes, their relationship with state power is quite different and very telling. Both white supremacy and global Islamic terrorism are almost entirely oppositional to existing state structures. They generally seek to overthrow, dismantle, or destroy the states they operate in or target.
Whereas Kahanism.
Kahanism, as we discussed, exists in that complex, almost symbiotic relationship with the Israeli state. While its revolutionary wing still seeks to overthrow Israel's democracy, its political wing has successfully integrated into the state apparatus, achieving ministerial power. This gives it a unique psychological and political position. It can operate both outside state structures, through groups like the Hilltop Youth, and inside them, through parties like Otzma Yehudit. This duality, operating both against and within state power, is not really shared by the other two movements in the same way.
Okay. So what does this all mean when we bring it together? We've covered so much ground, from the deep normative psychology of Judaism, emphasizing internal management, responsibility, meaning-making, resilience, all the way to these dangerous, violent fringes of extremism.
Well, I think it means we absolutely must be precise in our analysis and our language. The crucial analytical error, the dangerous conflation, is to equate mainstream Jewish concepts like chosenness, which, as we saw, is primarily a doctrine of obligation and finding purpose in suffering, with the ideology of Kahanist Jewish supremacy, which is clearly a doctrine of entitlement, demanding subjugation, ethnic purification, and the rejection of democratic values. These are profoundly different psychological and ideological worlds.
So mainstream Judaism offers a framework for purpose and endurance, while Kahanism offers entitlement and demands subjugation.
Yes, exactly. Mainstream Jewish thought, with its emphasis on the Yetzer and Tikkun Olam, provides a framework of purpose that allows for the endurance of suffering, often framing it as a consequence of a difficult but sacred mission. This is psychologically almost the opposite of the ideology of Jewish supremacy espoused by Kahanists. Kahanism is a doctrine of entitlement based on supremacist interpretation of identity that demands the subjugation and expulsion of the other, and crucially, the purification of the in-group from the perceived taint of democratic and secular values they see as foreign.
And the comparative analysis we did really drives home the importance of nuance, doesn't it? While these different extremist movements might share some common psychological mechanisms of radicalization, their core ideologies, their whys, are fundamentally distinct.
Yes, absolutely. The comparative analysis clearly demonstrates that while all violent extremist movements may share certain common psychological mechanisms, they leverage grievance, they dehumanize enemies, they offer identity to the vulnerable, their core ideologies, their historical contexts, and their ultimate goals are profoundly different. White supremacy is a global racial project animated by a paranoid anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Islamic terrorism is a transnational religious project driven by a utopian and apocalyptic vision aimed at global dominance. Kahanism is a territorially focused, theocratic ethno-nationalist project with that unique symbiotic relationship with state power in Israel. To equate these distinct phenomena, to treat them as interchangeable, is to obscure rather than clarify our understanding of extremism.
So, a nuanced understanding, recognizing both the similarities in process and the differences in content, is vital for any effective counter-extremism strategies.
Absolutely vital. Any effective strategies must be tailored to address the specific psychological hooks and ideological narratives of each distinct movement. You need a different approach for the aggrieved racial entitlement driving the white supremacist compared to the utopian apocalyptic idealism motivating the jihadi, or the theocratic nationalist fervor fueling the Kahanist. A one-size-fits-all approach to understanding or combating violent extremism is almost certainly destined to fail. It's this clear-eyed recognition, seeing both the shared psychological pathways to hate and the unique ideological content of that hate, that is the essential first step in any meaningful analysis or intervention.
It really underscores the complexity. After digging into all of this, these complex psychologies of identity, trauma, resilience, and extremism, what stands out most powerfully to you about the sheer power of belief itself? Belief for good or, tragically, for ill. Something for our listeners to think about.